The event tonight is going to be an absolute treat. We're going to meet some researchers from the University of Oxford who are going to tell us about what actually happens inside the brain when somebody has COVID. I'm absolutely fascinated to find out more about this. So without further ado, I think it's time to share a little video with you before we hand over to our speakers.
It is a killer, it's COVID.
The long-term effects of COVID seem to be worse than anyone thought they would be.
COVID, or coronavirus disease, is a respiratory illness. It affects the airways and lungs and has caused a global pandemic. It has affected more than 20 million people across the world. There are many who have survived, but it is associated with a risk of death.
My first symptoms were more cold-like. All I remember was waking up 3 weeks later in the John Radcliffe. It appears I had been resuscitated.
COVID can affect patients in many ways, such as headaches, loss of sense of smell, sense of taste. It can cause weakness, numbness and tingling, and memory problems.
The first thing that happened during the pandemic was that I became sick with COVID, and that has influenced my research. What's really struck me is that the effects of COVID have lasted for many months. I'm still breathless walking up a hill, and I'm having trouble with breathing. Quite prominent fatigue over the last 6 months that's only very slowly resolving.
Over a period I had sepsis. I also had pneumonia.
There's been a sort of a brain fog that's taken a long time to resolve. We need to understand what's going on in the brain because clearly it's impacting people in different ways and the disease isn't just going to go away.
The virus is primarily attracted to the lungs. It can invade other organs such as the heart, the kidneys, the liver, and the brain. Our research is showing that some of this damage may be persistent in people. We are about to research the implications and the long-term effects in people recovering from this disease.
Well, hello, welcome to this session where we take a look inside the COVID brain. So I'm Stuart Clare, I'm a researcher at the University of Oxford. And we're here to look behind the scenes of the research that we're doing, trying to understand what happens when people's brains, when they have COVID. Well, I'm joined by people you've just seen in the video now, and I'll ask them to briefly introduce themselves. So I'll start with you, Kyle.
Hello, I'm Kyle Pattinson. I am an anaesthetist and a neuroscience researcher based at the University of Oxford. And my particular interest is trying to understand how the brain controls breathing and breathlessness.
Thank you. And Betty?
Hi, I'm Betty. I'm a cardiologist and a researcher at the University of Oxford, and I've been interested in the multi-organ effects of COVID-19, including the effects of COVID-19 on the brain.
And finally, David, I'm really pleased you've been able to join us. You're not a researcher, but what's your role in all of this?
I'm a patient who contracted COVID in March prior to the British lockdown. And I've been through various contributions towards COVID from then.
Great, thank you, David. And we'll hear more from you throughout this session today. Now, we're going to hopefully shed some light on questions that you might have about COVID. So if you've got any questions about COVID or our research or the brain, feel free to pop any questions in the Q&A box. So please use the Q&A box rather than the chat box, and we'll try our best to give you an answer. But let's just start with a question for you, David. When did you first realise you had the symptoms of COVID?
When I woke up basically in the Radcliffe after 3 weeks. My initial symptoms were not exactly as COVID was given over the television in the first early months. I had things like intermittent nosebleeds. I did have sort of a respiratory problem, but I've always had that as a child, so I did take it on board that yes, it was COVID orientated. again, we went to a 50-year-old's birthday party. Somebody came up from another part of England. They were the people that introduced me to COVID. Subsequently, the man with the couple had since died of COVID. Sorry.
So you were unconscious in hospital?
Yes, that's
Right.
that's the only time that they gave me the news that yes, I had COVID.
Goodness. And Betty, what are the kind of typical symptoms that you see of people who come into hospital with COVID?
So it is a respiratory viral illness, and the symptoms are predominantly respiratory to begin with. So symptoms of breathlessness, cough, fever, and then in addition to these respiratory symptoms, people can experience non-specific symptoms that could suggest neurological involvement, such as headache, confusion, lack of sleep or inability to sleep.
Yeah.
So those are some of the symptoms.
Right. Okay. And we've got a question here from Anne, who's asked that many people say that COVID-19 is a just to question this a bit. Many people say that COVID-19 is a form of flu. Is that true?
No. Sorry.
You're sure about that, David? It's definitely not a form of flu.
Yeah.
And Betty, what do you say from the clinical perspective?
Well,
so there are some features that are in common to the flu. So the fact that the lungs are involved and some of the symptoms like fever, breathlessness, and cough may occur in people who have the flu. But COVID does have unique manifestations which are clearly distinct from the flu. And yeah, this is what we're seeing as time goes by.
Yeah, right. And there's a couple of other questions, but I think they might fit in a bit nicely a bit later on. So I will come to those questions. Thank you for putting them in the box, and we will come to those. But Carl, I mean, you were working frontline in the hospital, and you got COVID. So how did your experience compare to what David's described?
Well, my experience was very different to that of David's in that I woke up with a relatively mild sore throat. I just felt very tired. Breathing was a little bit difficult in as much as it felt you really noticed your breathing walking up and down the stairs. But the most strongest thing really was a sense of just fatigue and not really being able to think very clearly. So I had 2 weeks sitting in the garden, enjoying the sunshine. And it slowly got better, but never really fully resolved. And it's now 6 months later, and I say I'm 95% back to normal. So really, the sort of the other extreme is that I wasn't very sick at the time, but the symptoms did go on for a long time and fluctuating. Some days are better than others. I think I must have caught a cold or something along the way because that sort of made the symptoms come back again. Yeah. So yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, interesting, Carl. So I think now would be a really good time to look at our second video, because I think we're going to move on a little bit to talk about the research that we are doing here in Oxford. So if we can cue up the second video, please, and then we've got some great questions in the chat to answer.
There have been studies that have shown that during the acute illness, COVID can cause inflammation of the brain. It can cause clots, which can produce a stroke. It can also cause a more long-term inflammatory disease, which causes more permanent changes in the brain.
Obviously, COVID is a respiratory condition, and it's right that a lot of the research that's going on already is looking at the drugs and the treatments that are really targeting this respiratory condition. But we do know that there is potentially a brain component to this. We know that because one of the symptoms is a loss of taste or smell. So it's very likely that this is affecting our nervous system.
Some people with COVID become extremely hypoxic. That means very low levels of oxygen in their blood. Low oxygen levels can affect the brain and cause brain damage. We're particularly interested in whether COVID causes long-term inflammation, whether it causes degeneration in the nerves, and we're also interested in how these respiratory areas communicate with other areas of the brain involved with perception.
We undertook a test called the Montreal Cognitive Assessment Test, which examines a number of aspects of cognition: orientation, memory, executive functioning, and attention. We found was that in survivors of COVID-19 that patients have trouble with the executive functioning, which essentially refers to their ability to perform complex tasks. One of the concerns that we've had following this illness is that the changes caused by COVID in the brain may resemble other infectious diseases that are associated with more long-term impairment in memory. Further research is required to examine or to understand the long-term effects over years of COVID.
Great, thank you. So in that session, in that video, Betty, you mentioned about researching long-term effects, and there's a question here in the Q&A box saying, what are the most important questions which need to be researched about long COVID? So maybe this is a good time for you to answer that.
Thank you. So long COVID is a spectrum of symptoms that include fatigue, breathlessness, and sort of non-specific symptoms which can't be explained by specific organ damage. And it's unusual, and we have seen it in survivors of COVID-19 in a study that we're doing in Oxford. And it's really quite interesting because conventional investigations, conventional tests that we do in hospital aren't able to detect anything specific that could explain these symptoms. I think I will ask Kyle to talk about his work, because this is really where the work that he's doing might make a difference here.
Is that what has been known so far about COVID and other coronaviruses is that they appear to affect an area of the brain called the brainstem. And this is an area that takes in particularly respiratory, cardiac signals and integrates sort of feelings, what the information from the body with the way you with consciousness. And this is an area that's thought to be particularly inflamed by COVID, and there's some new research coming out to show that. And what we're trying to understand really, and our hypothesis is that by inflaming the brainstem, these perceptual systems get deranged, the systems that regulate your control of your blood pressure and your breathing get deranged. So you end up with a whole host of different symptoms. And what we're doing with our brain imaging is using very specialized focused scanning that looks at this very small structure with a lot of detail, and that's what we're up to at the moment.
Yeah, Carl, thanks. And there's another question that's come in on this, which I think might be be interesting to maybe you're able to answer. How do you feel long COVID compares to typical post-virus fatigue? Is there something different about long COVID to a typical post-virus fatigue?
I don't think we know that at the moment. I think we don't. Post-viral fatigue syndrome is poorly understood, and the long COVID is poorly understood. And hopefully through the research that we're doing and through other collaborations, we might be able to answer that.
And Betty, in the presentation just there, you mentioned inflammation. So what's the brain inflammation like that we're talking about in someone with COVID?
Thank you, Stuart. So what we know is that, in people who pass away or who unfortunately succumb to the disease, on an autopsy study, there's evidence of inflammatory cells or markers of inflammation within the brain. When you look at survivors in general, like in the broad scheme of things, there aren't that many people who develop this as a complication. We would, papers talk about 1 to 3% of people may have inflammation in the brain. And this is typically detected. Obviously, first, people might have symptoms that would suggest that the brain is involved, but they will, if they have an MRI scan, this can be detected on MRI scan if they've got inflammation of the brain.
Right, okay. And Kyle, the one of the other things that came up in the video there was about the patients experiencing a loss of taste and smell. Has that got anything to do with the brain inflammation, or is that something very separate?
It probably does, but we don't know exactly how yet. Clearly, what it does show is that the virus is getting into the brain and causing these effects. So it's helpful in directing the research. But I don't know whether people who have loss of smell have got more long COVID, or we just don't know at the moment. There was an interesting study that where they did very careful smell testing in people with COVID, and found that 90% of people lost their sense of smell, but only half of them actually noticed it.
Oh, really? Oh, wow. Yeah. David, was that something that you noticed? Did you notice the loss of smell or taste?
No, not necessarily. No.
Oh, okay.
I think with Carl's principle, yes, you do. You were very weak, and it still hasn't resolved itself with me like Kyle. That yes, you're getting stronger and stronger and stronger, but it was intimated to me that it certainly will be up to a year and possibly 18 months before I'm thoroughly back to my normal self.
Yeah, great. So we've got another question here, which I'll perhaps give to Betty. Are people's brains likely to be able to relearn as seen from brain injuries?
That's a great question. It really comes down to the plasticity of the brain and, if the person is younger and the extent of injury as well. So a number of factors that would determine whether someone's likely to recover. Again, we don't know very much about recovery because we've only known this disease for a few months. So, it might take us much longer to truly answer that question. But the work that we've done, the preliminary work that we've done suggests that if you're older, you're less resilient, you have less reserve, and it's possible that might tip you into more long-term dysfunction.
Right.
I take it as the elderly recover less quickly than the younger generation. But,
absolutely, David.
And I think it's interesting that there was that comment earlier about why how much the severity of the disease links to the experience of long COVID as well, and it's obviously interesting that there's a real spread of symptoms with this condition. So we've established that the brain is playing a really crucial role in COVID, but in this next video we're going to show how exactly we do find out what's going on inside the brain. So if we watch the next video, please.
Science usually takes many, many months to years to plan and prepare because of the severity and this impact of the disease in this country and in the world. We knew it had to be looked at really quickly, so we were able to scan our first patient in about May, and then we've been scanning since then. MRI, or magnetic resonance imaging, that uses a really strong magnet to take pictures inside the brain. What we're doing here, which is different from other studies, is we're using a very powerful MRI scanner, which is more powerful than a typical hospital MRI scanner. You are experiencing a magnetic field of 7 Tesla. A 1 Tesla magnet would pick up a car, so our 7 Tesla magnet is incredibly strong. And then we measure the small signals that the water inside the brain is giving off. We put all those signals, measure them through supercomputers, and that turns those into pictures of the brain. We can look at what the brain looks like, and we can see how that might reflect some of the inflammation or other damage that COVID may be causing. But we can also look at what the brain is doing. We can look at the blood flow and how the brain is functioning. And we can look at the blood flow in a particular part of the brain stem, deep down inside the brain. If we saw some changes in the COVID patients, it might help us understand how COVID is affecting the person's ability to breathe and regulate their breathing, which we do know is one of the symptoms that some people experience long after the initial infection. We're also measuring some of the brain chemistry. We're looking at some of the key chemicals, the neurotransmitters inside the brain, and we're looking to see where any of those are affected. And these are really, really tiny concentrations that we're trying to pick up here. When we look at these really small changes across a lot of people, it might indicate what part of the cell functioning is being affected by the disease. The brain responds very quickly and rapidly to the assault that it has on it, and so effect of COVID, the brain is going to be responding to that, and looking at the long-term effects will be quite important for understanding the disease.
So David, you went inside our brain scanner for the research study, didn't you? What was it like for you to be inside the brain scanner?
It was like a normal MRI, except my head was kept very, very, very still. Mm-hmm. But to some people, I don't mind MRIs. You know, it virtually sends me to sleep sometimes. But no, it didn't cause any undue problems at all.
Yeah, and
I can imagine if somebody is very claustrophobic or whatever. Yes, I can understand that. Yes, they may have a problem, but no, it's quite cozy.
You didn't find it too unpleasant at all. That's really good.
Not a problem.
That's great. So Betty, as a doctor, you know all the different kinds of methods we can use to assess the patient. What's the benefit of using MRI to study COVID? Oh.
So MRI gives us high resolution images of the organs. I look at MRI as a way to provide a virtual autopsy of a living individual. As hard as it sounds, it gives you quite a lot of detail about anatomy, which would not have been possible, you know, say a couple of decades, no, more than 30, 40 years ago. So MRI is a sophisticated machine that really allows you to look inside the organ and give you details about the blood flow to the organs, such as the brain, and the composition of the tissue that we're studying.
Yeah, and you're taking pictures just not of the brain, but you're also taking pictures of different organs in the body as well.
Yes. So the fantastic thing about an MRI is that, firstly, it does not involve any radiation. You can do or you can get a lot of pictures of the body without any injection of contrast agents. And so we're now doing a study looking at people who are recovering from COVID, where we're studying a number of organs, including the lungs, the heart, the liver, the brain, and the kidneys. And all of this can be done without radiation or injection or contrast agents. The only thing is that it does take about 70 minutes. So for people who don't like being in a tunnel for that long, it's not the best scan.
Do you find most people manage to tolerate it okay, or do some people find it too hard to be in for that time? Sorry, Betty, your mic is muted.
It does depend. So there are people out there who are claustrophobic and who can't be in close spaces, and so some people can't tolerate scans that long.
Yeah. And Kyle, we've got a question here from George, which asks, why do we have to use a much stronger MRI scanner than a typical hospital scanner for this study? What's the benefit of using our very strong scanner?
Right, okay. So we're really, really interested in the brainstem, and the brainstem is a very small part of the brain that moves with every heartbeat and every breath. So normal MRI scans just don't get the resolution that we need. There are different things we want to measure. For the first thing we want to do is measure the different metabolites, different chemicals in the brainstem, and 7 Tesla scanner there has got the power to differentiate between different chemicals that the 3 Tesla and the normal scanners don't. We want to look at how the brainstem communicates with the rest of the brain, so we use something called functional MRI. And again, what we want to do is we want to look at the relatively small areas in this brainstem. So we need to have a much finer grained scan of the brain activity. So really, this is the ideal use for 7T, and we've been using 7T to study the brainstem for the last 10 years or so, and understanding breathing. So we're in a really strong position to get some quite interesting answers, I hope.
Yeah, that's really good, Carl. And actually, that sort of ties back to a question that was asked earlier on: what were people doing before they studied COVID? And actually, this was an area of how the brainstem controls breathing that you're already actively working in. So you were really well placed to start this research.
That's absolutely right. And since Stuart so well explained my research, I'll explain Stuart's research. And Stuart has worked as a team of optimizing the 7 Tesla scanner to make it work as well as it can, and particularly across the whole of the UK. So there's 7 or so 7 Tesla scanners, and over the last few years, Stuart and others have worked together to make sure that we get the same signals out of each of the scanners. So it's really exciting to be able to use this now.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Carl. And it's true. What we're trying to do with this is not just study this in Oxford, but use the fact that there are other 7 Tesla scanners around the country to see whether we can run a larger study. So that's something we're trying to do now. You mentioned earlier, Carl, about brain chemistry. What are the kind of brain chemistry changes we're hoping to see in these scans, or we might potentially see in these scans?
Well, I think what we're expecting to see is chemical markers relating to inflammation, and I suppose what we're expecting is that the people with more inflamed brain stems might have worse ongoing symptoms. So that's the test. There is some work coming out showing that there is, as I said, more brainstem and brain injury markers. I mean, you may, for example, find actually that the inflammation is there, but actually people's symptoms don't. It doesn't explain people's symptoms, and so it's all very interesting to see what we'll see, really.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, you've heard there we're at the early stages of our research, but what does the future hold for our understanding of the COVID brain? Well, this final video of this session will hope to give an outlook on what we're looking to achieve.
Brain controls our ability to breathe. It controls the functioning of vital organs, and therefore it's absolutely necessary to fully understand how the brain is affected both in the short term and the long term by this global disease.
Even before COVID, up to 10% of the population suffered with some kind of breathing difficulty, impairing people's quality of life.
And it was really quite something to see how quickly everything came together to make this research happen.
It has been a huge driving force for researchers from multiple disciplines to come together to answer some critical questions.
At the moment, we are collecting the data, we're comparing it to other studies we're keeping a very close eye on and trying to piece together a story that helps us understand the effect on COVID in the brain.
I think one of the things that COVID will do is help us develop ways to treat breathlessness that can be applied across a whole range of diseases, even once COVID has become less prevalent.
There may well be long-term psychiatric effects that are brought about by this massive period of trauma.
Studies have shown that patients who are recovering from COVID continue to have symptoms of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder.
This is such a new disease and we are working as fast as we can to try and understand it, but there's still an awful lot that we don't know. And it's likely that we're going to be looking at these things for many, many years to come. There are a lot more questions to be answered, not just the direct effect of COVID itself, infection, but the effect of this whole period on the brain.
So Betty, when do you think we can expect to have some of these questions answered about the effects of COVID on the brain? When do you think we're going to see the first results published?
So our papers actually will be on the preprint medRxiv from Monday next week, and it's currently under review with eClinical Medicine, a medical journal of the Lancet. So, watch the space; it'll be out soon.
Yeah. Okay. And Kyle, you were talking about some of these studies that we're doing at 7 Tesla. How long before we're starting to see results from these studies on the brainstem and breathing?
Okay, so we've scanned 10 people so far, and what we can tell so far is that our data is looking nice. The protocols are working. Obviously, we've had to tweak some of the scans based upon what we've found in terms of the way the scanner works. We'll need to scan about 150 people, we think, before we get some really strong results. And obviously what we want to do with the results is find out, is use them to work out treatments for long COVID. That may, for example, be looking at what whether there are drugs that might be able to help the brain relearn, as we were talking about plasticity earlier, or it may be particular targets in their own right. So we're hoping to get funded fully and get the data out in the next year or so. But there we go.
Right. And in that video, Betty, you mentioned depression and anxiety as a long-term symptom. Is it something you're seeing in the clinic?
Yes, so in our study of follow-up COVID survivors from hospital, what we found is that more than 30% of people report symptoms of moderate to severe depression and anxiety. What we haven't done is look at symptoms of post-traumatic stress, which has also been reported by others in the community. So it's definitely debilitating from an emotional perspective as well.
Yeah. And are these psychiatric effects as a direct effect of the virus, or are they sort of effect of the sort of the challenging circumstances that we're all finding ourselves in?
I think it's a combination. It's, what we're seeing is we haven't seen an association between the findings, the brain MRI findings in survivors and burden of depression or anxiety symptoms. But what we are seeing is that the more disabled someone feels, so the more breathless they are, the more fatigued they are more depressed. So there's definitely a connection with this long COVID, fatigue, shortness of breath, the symptoms, and the way people feel.
Yeah. So we've got a few more questions come in now, which is great. So Mark's asked, what resolution are you getting with our 7 Tesla MRI scanners, 1mm or better than that? I can answer that one because I've helped develop the protocols for those, and that's the pictures of what the brain looks like, the structural pictures of the brain, 0.7mm, 700 microns detail, which is finer than we get with other scans. But what Kyla was also saying was that we look in really small areas of the brainstem. So for our functional scans that we do in the brainstem, we're getting 1mm functional resolution there.
And we can also use the extra power not to make the voxels, the resolution smaller, but for example, for the spectroscopy, which is looking at metabolites, we've got a much bigger area we're looking at, but we can get very high resolution between the different spectra of the different chemicals. And then sometimes we want to look at, instead of looking at the areas, we want to look at the time, how fast areas talk to each other, and we can do that. We can look at that highest time resolution with the 7T. So it gives us lots of benefits.
Yeah. So a quick question. Sorry? Was someone saying?
We sometimes say it's like comparing driving a Ferrari to a Land Rover. And it goes a lot faster, but it's much easier to drive into a ditch. You're not careful.
Right. So there's a really interesting question here from Margaret. Are you, and I'm happy for anyone to pick up on that, Betty or Kyle, or even I might have a go, but are you doing studies where you recruit healthy people beforehand and monitor them over time so you can see how the brain changes during and after if they're unfortunate enough to catch COVID? And I think this relates to a study that is happening, Biobank study. Betty, do you want to talk about that? We need to unmute your mic again, Betty.
That's right. Thanks, Stuart. I keep forgetting. So the UK Biobank is a national study of 100,000 people across the UK, where people across the UK have a series of investigations that assesses the health of multiple organs in their body. And one investigation is an MRI of the brain, MRI of the heart, and liver. And so it is possible to study these people who have come in and already had their MRI before COVID, and then study them after. And in fact, that's what is currently planned now by the UK Biobank leaders and by the consortium.
Right. And yeah, that's good. And so, I guess that's the study that's going to be, going, ongoing over time, and it will give us a really, rich amount of data of a lot of people over time to really be able to understand all the differences that everyone, different people experience. I guess we said earlier there are very many different types of symptoms, so being able to look at so many people will help us to see, what effects in the brain are linking to which symptoms. So what other questions? I mean, there's a really good question which it says, are there resources for wider reading around this topic yet? So I don't know if Kyle or Betty have any suggestions on this. I guess because COVID is so new, I'm not sure there's a lot which has been written for a general audience, unless either of you know of anything we can recommend.
There's a fair amount written on websites like The Conversation about long COVID. The NIHR, National Institute for Health Research, has some relatively accessible information about long COVID. The brain side of things isn't covered massively because we just don't know, and the information is slowly coming out. But it just seems to be coming out all the time, really.
Yeah. Great. Well, I'm glad people are interested, and we might think on our website to see whether we can put any links through to any articles that we find.
That's a good idea, yeah.
There's a question which says, what's the cost of a 70 MRI scan? Which is, the 70 scanner is about 5 times more expensive than a normal hospital scanner. So at the moment, they're only in research institutions. They're very expensive. But as Kyle said, they do give us so much richer and more interesting data there. So they are expensive, but for these research studies, they make a real big difference to us being able to detect really small changes. So a few more questions. Brilliant, coming in. We've got there's a few which are sort of more general questions, probably a bit outside of just the brain side. People are very interested about collaboration between researchers who are studying COVID and scientists working on finding vaccines and all these different things. And I don't know if there's anything we want to say about the level of collaboration that has been going on, because I think that's something that I've found really quite remarkable at this time, how much collaboration is going on. Betty, what's been your experience in that?
Absolutely, Stuart. I think as much as as difficult it has been for many of us over the last few months, not just directly because of COVID, but the effects of lockdown and being stuck at home, there's been a lot of good that's come out of this time. Particularly the speed with which we're able to get things done, do research in multiple aspects, and collaborate with people so efficiently. And I've certainly seen that with the research that I'm doing, along with Kyle, in our post-COVID survivors.
Yeah. Well, we've actually come to the end of our time here today. It's been so good to hear everything. Thank you, Betty and Kyle, very much, and Dave particularly, for sharing your knowledge and experience with us today. It's been brilliant to get so many questions come in, really interesting and really engaging questions. So thank you so much for that. We really enjoyed talking about this and hearing your questions. So I'll just hand to Kathy for the end of the session.
Well, thank you to you, Stuart, for managing the questions so well and for chairing our panel so eloquently. Thank you to Kyle, Betty and David for their input. I mean, it really has been eye-opening to find what you've been discovering. And of course, there's still so much more to learn. So maybe when we have next year's festival, we can have you back and we can get an update on all of your research. Thank you to our audience for joining us today. I hope you have enjoyed the Explorazone Digital experience. There is still a little time to go and look at the booths in the exhibition hall, and some of our researchers are still available to chat with you. So if you go into any of the booths, you can click on the chat button and you may still find some hardworking researchers who've been there all day since 8 o'clock this morning, who are more than happy to chat with you. If you've enjoyed the festival and you would like to support us, please do consider making a donation. The festival is run by a very small charity. We only have 2 paid members of staff pulling it all together. And we do rely very much on our sponsors and on donations. So all that remains for me to say is there's still another 2 weeks of festival to go. So come to the website, if-oxford.com, click on some more events, and we hope to see you again really soon. Thank you and good night.